Hello everyone, welcome to the political science tutorial. This is the one place to learn everything about political science. This channel will help you all with all the concepts of political science as well as theories in both English and Hindi. So spread a word regarding this channel. Hello and welcome to this fourth very important part of the Crown Rule in India. And in this fourth part we are going to talk about the Indian Council of Act of 1909. And before we begin with this act, I just want to inform you all that before this we have already covered three other articles, three other acts under this Crown Rule, and the link to those tutorials you will find in the description box below as well as on I button on top. आप सबका स्वागत है इस नए ट्यूटोरियल में। ये चौथा पार्ट है क्राउन रूल इन इंडिया का, और इसके पहले हमने तीन ऑलरेडी एक्ट कवर किए हैं और उन तीनों ट्यूटोरियल के लिंक आपको डिस्क्रिप्शन बॉक्स में या फिर आई बटन के ऊपर मिल जाएंगे। तो फिर चलिए शुरू करते हैं। द फोर्थ वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट एक्ट ऑफ क्राउन रूल इन इंडिया, दैट इज़ द इंडियन काउंसिल ऑफ एक्ट ऑफ 1909. वेल, this act is also known as Morley-Minto Reform Act. The reason is very simple, because Lord Morley was the then Secretary of the State for India and Lord Minto was the then Viceroy of India. So therefore this act, the Indian Council of Act of 1909, is also named and also known as Morley-Minto Reform Act. Well, let's begin and let's start the first very important feature of this act. Well, the point number one, the first feature of Indian Council of Act of 1909 is that it considered increased the size of legislative council both at central as well as provincial level. Therefore the number of members in the central legislative council was raised from 16 to 60, whereas the number of members in the provincial legislative assembly was not uniform. Now the first very important feature of this act basically talks about that with this act of 1909 they finally considered that there has to be an increase in the size of the legislative council both at central as well as provincial level, and keeping this into the mind they finally raised the number especially at central level or at central legislative council from 16 to 60, whereas the number of members in the provincial legislative council was not uniform because it differs from the size of the state and the demography. So the first very important जो point है इस फीचर का कि यहाँ पर उन्होंने फाइनली नंबर को बढ़ा दिए। पहले 16 मेंबर्स थे सेंट्रल लेजिस्लेटिव काउंसिल के, उसको बढ़ा के अभी 60 कर दिए, और इसी तरह जो प्रोविंशियल लेजिस्लेटिव काउंसिल के भी जो मेंबर थे उनको भी बढ़ाया, लेकिन उनके जो नंबर्स थे वो यूनिफॉर्म नहीं थे, क्योंकि हर एक प्रोविंस डिफरेंट थी, उसकी डेमोग्राफी डिफरेंट थी, उसकी साइज़ डिफरेंट थी, और इसी के वजह से नंबर कोई यूनिफॉर्म नहीं रहा, but they increase it at that level also. So this is the first very feature of Indian Council of Act 1909, that they increased the number finally from 16 to 60 at Central Legislative Council. Moving on to point number two, that it retained official majority in the Central Legislative Council but allowed the provincial legislative councils to have non-official majority. It's very simple point that with this feature they retain their official majority in the Central Legislative Council, whereas on the other hand they allowed the provincial legislative councils to have non-official majority. Now here we also have to remember that although the central as well as provincial legislative councils are both a very important institution, but by and large it is always the central which has the more power and the provincial legislative council had some little power, and therefore it is very obvious that they did not allow the membership of non-official majority to increase at central level, because that is where the actual power lies, and there they maintain their superiority, whereas at provincial state level or provincial state legislative council level they allowed to have a non-official majority. दूसरा जो बहुत इम्पोर्टेंट पॉइंट है इस एक्ट का कि उन्होंने अपनी जो ऑफिशियल मेजॉरिटी थी सेंट्रल लेजिस्लेटिव काउंसिल में उसको उन्होंने रिटेन किया, उन्होंने इसको बरकरार रखा और नॉन ऑफिशियल मेंबर को वहाँ पर बढ़ने नहीं दिया। वेरेज एट स्टेट लेजिस्लेटिव काउंसिल मतलब प्रोविंशियल लेजिस्लेटिव काउंसिल के लेवल पे उन्होंने नॉन ऑफिशियल मेजॉरिटी को बढ़ावा दे दिया कि वहाँ पर वो बढ़ सकते हैं, वहाँ पर वो मेजॉरिटी में रह सकते हैं, लेकिन सेंट्रल लेजिस्लेटिव काउंसिल में उनकी मेजॉरिटी नहीं रहेगी बल्कि ऑफिशियल जो मेजॉरिटी रहेगी वो वहाँ पर बरकरार रहेगी। सो दे बेसिकली मेंटेन द बैलेंस बोथ एट सेंट्रल एज वेल एज प्रोविंशियल स्टेट legislative council. Moving on to third very important feature of this act, that it enlarged the deliberation function of the legislative council at both the level. For example, members were allowed to ask supplementary questions, move resolutions on the budget and so on. Now this is another very important point or a part of this act, that they allowed to have more discussion, deliberative functions of the legislative council both at the both level. That means they allowed to have more discussion, they allowed their members to raise any supplementary question, to move resolution especially on the budget and so on. That means they now allowed even non-official members to ask question both at the central as well as provincial legislative assembly, and this in a way somehow we can see that a democratic process was already been initiated by the British government in India by allowing the members to raise questions, to move resolution as well as move resolution on budget and so on. तीसरा जो बहुत महत्वपूर्ण पॉइंट यहाँ पर हमें नोटिस करना है कि इस एक्ट के अंतर्गत उन्होंने जो मेंबर्स थे उनको प्रश्न पूछने की आज़ादी दे दी। पहले ये आज़ादी उनको नहीं थी, वो इनफैक्ट लिमिटेड थी। अभी इस एक्ट के तहत उन्हें सप्लीमेंट्री क्वेश्चन पूछने की भी आज़ादी है, कोई भी रेजोल्यूशन मूव करने की भी आज़ादी है, एज वेल एज स्पेशली रेजोल्यूशन ऑन बजट। मतलब अभी नॉन ऑफिशियल मेंबर्स को भी पार्टिसिपेट करने का मौका मिलता है, क्वेश्चन पूछने का मौका मिलता है, या फिर टू बी अ पार्ट ऑफ अ डेलिब्रेटिव फंक्शंस ऑफ लेजिस्लेटिव काउंसिल both at central as well as provincial level. So this is the third very important point of this act, और इस एक्ट के तहत कुछ एक डेमोक्रेसी की तरह अभी फंक्शनिंग हो रही है। भले वो डेमोक्रेसी आम आदमी को नहीं है, आम आदमी को ये पावर नहीं दिया है सरकार से क्वेश्चन पूछने का, बट एटलीस्ट दे हैव गिवन these powers to those non-official members who are part and parcel of these legislative councils at both central as well as provincial level. आगे चलते हुए we have a fourth point, and fourth point basically talks about that it provides for the first time for the association of Indians with the executive councils of the viceroy and governors, and with this Satyendra Prasad Sinha became the first Indian to join the viceroy executive councils. He was appointed as the law member. Now this is very important development under this act of 1909, that it provided for the first time the association of Indians with the executive council of the viceroy and governor. That means for the first time Indians were given chance to be the part of that executive councils, which always gives advice to the viceroy as well as to the governor. And with this, the first Indian, that is Satyendra Prasad Sinha, became the first Indian to join the Viceroy Executive Council, and he was specially appointed as a law member of the Indian Council of Act of 1909. So this is another very important aspects of this act. चौथा जो बहुत महत्वपूर्ण पॉइंट यहाँ पर है कि पहली बार किसी इंडियन को एग्जीक्यूटिव काउंसिल ऑफ वाइसरॉय या फिर गवर्नर का मेंबर बनने की बारी आई है। और इसके चलते हुए सत्येंद्र प्रसाद सिन्हा वो पहले इंडियन बने जो वायसरॉय एग्जीक्यूटिव काउंसिल के मेंबर बने, और ना कि मेंबर बट वो ही वॉज अपॉइंटेड एज अ लॉ मेंबर ऑफ द एंटायर एग्जीक्यूटिव काउंसिल। नाउ दिस इज़ द फर्स्ट बिगिनिंग, एज आई सेड ये पहली बार हुआ है, और ये हुआ है बिकॉज ऑफ इंडियन काउंसिल ऑफ एक्ट ऑफ 1909 एंड वेरियस रिफॉर्म्स विच दे इंट्रोड्यूस्ड to initiate and to seek support of Indians when it comes to administration of their own country. Moving on to point number 5, that it introduced a system of communal representation for Muslims by accepting the concept of separate electorate. Under this, the Muslim members were to be elected only by Muslim voters. Thus, the act legalized communalism, and Lord Minto came to be known as the father of communal electorate. Now this is another very important point. In fact, this point later on became the bone of contention between the British as well as the Indian freedom fighters, as well as especially the Congress of that time. Now under this point, they for the first time introduced a system of communal representation, and under this communal representation, and under this, the Muslim members were to be elected only by Muslim voters. That means only Muslim can elect Muslim members for these legislative council, which was actually opposed by Congress of that time and many other political fronts. In fact, with this reform, with this recommendation under this act, they actually legalized the communalism in India, and because of this, Lord Minto was always known as, and in fact came to be known as, father of communal electorate. And with this we have a communal electorate issue which has been popped out in Indian freedom struggle, and eventually it took a different shape over a period of time. पांचवा जो बहुत महत्वपूर्ण पॉइंट है इस फीचर का और या फिर इस एक्ट का, ये है कि इन्होंने पहली बार एक ऐसा सिस्टम इंट्रोड्यूस किया जिसको हम कम्युनल रिप्रेजेंटेशन के नाम से जाना जाते हैं। और इस कम्युनल रिप्रेजेंटेशन में उन्होंने एक ऐसा मुद्दा यहाँ पर रख दिया कि मुस्लिम मेंबर्स जो रहेंगे लेजिस्लेटिव काउंसिल के, उसको सिर्फ मुस्लिम वोटर्स ही इलेक्ट करेंगे, और इसके चलते हुए एक कम्युनलिज्म को इंट्रोड्यूस किया, या फिर कम्युनलिज्म को एक लीगलाइज्ड फ्रेमवर्क दे दिया। और ये पूरी जो स्टोरी थी इसके पीछे जो इंसान थे वो थे लॉर्ड मिंटो, और इसी के कारण लॉर्ड मिंटो को फादर ऑफ कम्युनल इलेक्टोरेट भी कहा गया है। सो इसके चलते आगे बहुत से इसके ऊपर क्वेश्चन भी उठाए थे, वो हम बाद में देखेंगे नेक्स्ट एक्ट हाउ इट टुक द एक्चुअल शेप। बट एज ऑफ नाउ this act introduced the system of communal representation for Muslims by accepting the concept of separate electorate, and under this Muslim members were to be elected only by Muslim voter, and thus this act legalized the communalism, and therefore Lord Minto came to be known as the father of communal electorate. And the last very important point or the feature of this act is it also provided for the separate representation of presidencies, corporation, chambers of commerce, universities and zamindars. So the sixth very important point is that it also, under this act, it also provided a separate representation of presidencies, corporations, all the chambers of commerce, universities of that time, as well as the zamindars. मतलब इस एक्ट के तहत सारे जो लोग रहेंगे, सारे जो स्टेक होल्डर्स हैं, उन सभी को सेपरेट रिप्रेजेंटेशन दिया जाएगा, भले वो प्रेसिडेंसी कॉरपोरेशंस हो, चैम्बर्स ऑफ कॉमर्स हो, यूनिवर्सिटीज़ हो या फिर ज़मींदार्स हो। तो ये सारे जो फीचर्स है, ये सारे जो रिफॉर्म्स हैं, ये रिफॉर्म्स के पीछे लॉर्ड मॉर्ली द देन सेक्रेटरी ऑफ स्टेट फॉर इंडिया थे, और लॉर्ड मिंटो who was then Viceroy of India, ये दो इंसान इस रिफॉर्म के पीछे थे, और ये रिफॉर्म को द इंडियन काउंसिल ऑफ एक्ट ऑफ 1909 से भी जाना जाता है। तो ये सारे 6 फीचर्स इस काउंसिल के हैं, इस ये इस इंडियन काउंसिल ऑफ एक्ट के तहत आते हैं। तो आई होप यू हैव अंडरस्टूड in short what is the Indian Council of Act of 1909 is all about. I will see you soon in next tutorial, and in next tutorial we shall talk about the fifth part of the Crown Rule in India, which is the Government of India Act of 1919. Till then, take care.